In 1850, Abraham Lincoln leaned toward his law partner during a quiet buggy ride and confided something he never repeated to anyone else. He told him his mother had been born illegitimate and that the man responsible was a Virginia nobleman whose name history had swallowed whole. That secret stayed buried for decades. Then in 2015, a DNA lab in Houston tested Lincoln's maternal descendants and found two things nobody predicted.
Lincoln's death generates the greatest what-if question of all time for Americans. What if Lincoln had lived?
The first confirmed Lincoln had been right about everything. The second uncovered a genetic marker so rare it connects his bloodline to a part of the world that has nothing to do with colonial Virginia. But here's the thing. The truly disturbing part of this story has nothing to do with DNA at all. It's about what America once did to women and children simply because of the circumstances of their birth. Once you understand it, Lincoln's entire story looks different. To understand why Lincoln's secret was so dangerous, you first have to understand the world that created the danger. In the late 18th and early 19th century America, the circumstances of your birth were not just personal history. They were a legal classification that followed you everywhere. English common law had a formal term for children born outside of marriage: filius nullius, nobody's child, no legal father, no inheritance rights, no recognized ancestry. The label did not just describe a birth circumstance. It erased an identity before the child could walk. And the punishment was not reserved for the child. The mother bore the full weight of what society demanded. In Virginia and Kentucky, an unmarried woman who gave birth had committed an offense against the moral order of the community. Courts summoned those women publicly. Neighbors attended as witnesses. Punishments ranged from fines to corporal punishment to public humiliation, designed to leave a mark that lasted for years. But here's what most people never talk about. The courts were not primarily enforcing morality. They were managing a budget. If a child had no legally recognized father, someone had to pay for that child. So courts used a mechanism called a bastardy bond, forcing the alleged father to guarantee financial support. Private relationships became courtroom evidence. Women's most intimate circumstances were turned into public record, examined in front of their entire community. The courts turned intimacy into public theater, not because they cared about the woman, because they did not want to pay for her child. And in politics, illegitimacy was a weapon. If your opponents could establish that someone in your immediate family had been born outside of marriage, they would use it to question your character and your right to hold office. Abraham Lincoln understood this better than almost anyone alive. Now meet Lucy Hanks, a young woman on the rough Virginia frontier in the late 1700s. On November 24, 1789, a Mercer County, Kentucky grand jury formally indicted her for fornication. In the legal language of that era, that charge carried exactly one meaning: an unmarried woman had given birth. The child's existence was the crime. 5 months after that indictment, Lucy wrote a handwritten note giving her consent to marry a man named Henry Sparrow. That note still exists today, spelling errors and all. They married on April 30th, 1790. Less than a month later, the court dropped all charges. A woman writing her way out of a criminal indictment simply by agreeing to marry. That is the system working exactly as designed. But Nancy still carried the Hanks name, not Sparrow. Under English common law, children born outside marriage took their mother's maiden name. The father remained a ghost. That name was a permanent social signal, and anyone in that community knew exactly what it announced. Nancy never chose any of this. The label was placed on her before she could speak, and the man she would one day raise grew up watching what that cost looked like from the inside. Around 1850, Abraham Lincoln was already a man whose ambitions reached well beyond the Illinois Circuit Courts. He had built one of the most respected legal practices in Springfield and anyone paying close attention could see he was building towards something much larger. William Herndon had been his law partner for years, sharing an office, riding court circuits together, watching Lincoln through long seasons of professional life. He was as close to Lincoln as anyone got. During one of those routine rides toward a court appearance, Lincoln spoke with an openness that was completely out of character for him. He told Herndon that his mother had been born outside of marriage, that her father was believed to be a well-bred man from Virginia, a planter of some standing, whose name had never appeared in any official record. Lincoln went further. He believed that his own intelligence, his analytical mind, his physical stature, his drive, none of it came from Thomas Lincoln, the frontier carpenter who could barely write his own name. It came from this unknown man who had fathered his mother and then disappeared from history completely. And then he said something that has echoed through American history ever since. He told Herndon that everything he was or hoped to become, he owed to his mother, God bless her. Then he asked Herndon to keep it a secret while he lived. Think about what Lincoln was doing in that moment. He was one of the most carefully constructed public figures of his era, a man who had built his entire reputation on directness, moral credibility, and plain honesty. He was confessing something that, in the wrong hands, could undo everything he'd spent his career building. And he was doing it in a moving buggy on a country road to the one person he trusted completely. History called him Honest Abe. That name is still how most of the world knows him. But this same man carried a silence about his own origin every single day, through every courtroom, every debate stage, every political campaign. The DNA did not reveal that contradiction. It just confirmed what had been true all along. Lincoln always knew who his mother was and exactly what that knowledge meant for everything he was building. There is something about that worth sitting with, not as a criticism, as a portrait of what survival required. Herndon kept his word for decades. He watched Lincoln debate Stephen Douglas across 7 Illinois towns. He watched him win the presidency in 1860. He watched him hold a fractured nation together through 4 years of its bloodiest war. And through all of it, Herndon said nothing about what he'd been told on that country road. Lincoln was assassinated in April 1865. 24 years later, Herndon made a decision that would fracture the historical community for the next century. He published a biography, not the polished, monument version Lincoln's family preferred, but the complicated one, the one that included the confession from the buggy. The reaction was immediate and ferocious. Robert Todd Lincoln, Abraham's surviving son, had spent years carefully managing his father's legacy, and this was the last thing he wanted in print. Critics attacked Herndon personally, called him a liar. Some suggested personal grudges. Some questioned his reliability altogether. The book became a full-scale cultural war between those who wanted Lincoln preserved as an untouchable icon and those who believed honoring him meant telling the truth about him. And here is what I find genuinely important about what Herndon published. He didn't do it while Lincoln was building his career, not during the presidency, not during the war. He waited 24 years after the assassination. At a certain point, keeping that secret was no longer loyalty to Lincoln. It was a choice about what kind of truth the country deserved to have. Herndon decided it deserved the real one. But here is the catch. There was physical evidence sitting in a Kentucky courthouse that had been there for over 100 years. Researchers who dug into the Mercer County archives found the 1789 fornication indictment against Lucy Hanks. The timeline matched perfectly. Nancy carrying the Hanks name instead of any stepfather's name matched. The pattern of children born before any marriage matched. Every thread pointed in the same direction. Then a counter-movement built momentum. A Kentucky researcher named Lewis Warren spent his career arguing the entire story was mythology. His claim was that Lucy Hanks was actually Lucy Shipley, a widow whose first husband had been a man named James Hanks, which would make Nancy's birth completely legitimate and Lincoln's confession nothing more than a family misunderstanding passed down through generations. Warren was absolutely certain. In 1941, he published his findings and publicly dismissed the Herndon account as nothing more than another Herndon myth. What followed was one of the longest genealogical arguments in American history. Two camps, both armed with evidence, both with reputations riding on the outcome, neither capable of delivering a final blow. The paper trail was simply too thin. Too many frontier records had been lost or had never existed in the first place. By the early 21st century, the debate had hit a wall no archive could break through. Documents alone were not going to settle this. Both theories had been examined and cross-referenced and argued over for so many generations that the stalemate felt permanent. What they needed was something older than any court record, something that did not require paper at all. They needed to read the genetic code itself. In 2015, a team of genetic genealogists decided to end this once and for all. Suzanne Holstrom, Nancy Royce, Stephen Whitlock, Richard Hillerman, and Gerald Haslam had collectively spent decades on the Hanks family history. This was not casual curiosity. Hillerman alone had been researching Nancy Hanks' maternal ancestry since 1980, pulling records from the Allen County Public Library, the University of Chicago, and the Library of Congress. These were people who had given entire careers to a question no surviving document had been able to answer. The tool was mitochondrial DNA. Most of the DNA in your body is a combination, half from your mother, half from your father, reshuffled every generation until the original signal is unrecoverable. Mitochondrial DNA works completely differently. It passes exclusively from mother to child, unchanged across generations. It doesn't mix, it doesn't recombine. A woman alive today can carry the exact same sequence as an ancestor who lived 500 years ago. A genetic time capsule threaded through an unbroken female line. This created an immediate problem. Abraham Lincoln has no living descendants. His last confirmed descendant died in 1985 without children. The Lincoln line is genetically extinct, but mitochondrial DNA doesn't require the direct line. It requires any living woman who can trace an unbroken female lineage back to the same maternal source. The researchers built two groups. Group A, living women descended from Anne Lee Hanks, Lucy's mother, Nancy's grandmother, through different family branches. Group B, women descended from the Shipley sisters, the exact family connection Warren's theory depended on. If Lucy Hanks had actually been Lucy Shipley, both groups would share the same mitochondrial DNA. If they were unrelated maternal lines, the DNA would show no overlap whatsoever. The samples went to Gene by Gene Laboratory in Houston. Results were announced on October 21, 2015. Every single woman in Group A matched perfectly. Group B showed completely different DNA. No shared maternal ancestor, not in historical times, not ever. The researchers ran the tests again, same result. The Shipley theory was dead. Herndon had been right all along. A 150-year debate settled in a laboratory. But then something else appeared in the results, something nobody was looking for. The haplogroup shared across all Hanks line descendants was haplogroup X1c, extraordinarily rare, especially in families with colonial American ancestry. Most colonial Americans of European descent carry common haplogroups like H, J, T, or K. Haplogroup H alone accounts for nearly half of all European mtDNA. X1c is a sub-branch of X1, which didn't spread widely in Northern Europe. It is found primarily in North Africa, the Horn of Africa, and the Near East. The highest concentration anywhere in the world is among the Druze people of Israel, Lebanon, and Syria, where it reaches 27% of the population. The researchers went looking for a genealogical answer to a historical debate and found an ancient migration pattern instead. And here is what that actually means. The entire mythology of pure colonial bloodlines was always a fiction. The system of shame that marked women like Lucy and permanently branded children like Nancy was built on top of a lie about blood purity that the DNA demolished in a single test. The science closed the debate, and in doing so, it cracks something open that goes far deeper than one family's history. Let's stop and actually meet Nancy Hanks, not as a footnote, not as a data point, but as a real woman who is legally classified as nobody before she drew her first breath. She was born around 1784 in what is now Mineral County, West Virginia. She was not raised by her mother Lucy. She was raised from infancy by her grandparents, Joseph and Anne Lee Hanks. When Joseph died around 1793, 9-year-old Nancy was sent to live with her aunt Elizabeth Hanks and Elizabeth's husband, Thomas Sparrow. For much of her childhood, she went by Nancy Sparrow, which only deepened the historical confusion about her origins for every researcher who came after her. And get this, Elizabeth and Thomas Sparrow were simultaneously raising another illegitimate child alongside Nancy, a boy named Dennis Hanks, born in 1799 to Nancy's youngest aunt. Illegitimacy ran through this family like a current nobody acknowledged out loud, but everyone understood completely. That was the only way to survive what the community demanded. Despite everything stacked against her from birth, Nancy grew into someone remarkable by the standards of her time and place. Neighbors described her as intelligent, deeply religious, and capable in the ways frontier life required. She learned to read, not a given for a woman in backcountry America at the turn of the 19th century. She did needlework and worked for neighboring families. In 1806, she married Thomas Lincoln. They had 3 children together: Sarah, Abraham, and Thomas Jr., who died in infancy. In 1818, a disease called milk sickness swept through their Indiana homestead. It came from drinking milk from cows that had eaten white snake root, though nobody understood the source at the time. Elizabeth and Thomas Sparrow, the aunt and uncle who had raised Nancy, died first. Weeks later, Nancy fell ill. She was 34 years old when she died. Abraham was 9. He and his father built her coffin with their own hands and buried her on a hillside south of the family farm. No elaborate ceremony, no recorded eulogy. A 9-year-old boy and a man who could barely write his own name, doing the only thing left to do for someone they loved. Years later, Lincoln said she gave him everything he was or ever hoped to be. He meant every word, and he carried the secret of her birth in silence for the rest of his life. Now here is what is actually disturbing about everything we've uncovered, and the framing matters here, so stay with me. The X1C haplogroup is not disturbing. That is ancient history, a genetic marker reminding us that human ancestry has always been far more layered and complex than any mythology has ever admitted. The pure bloodline story was always a lie. The DNA just made that undeniable. What is disturbing is the system that enclosed every person in this story from the moment Lucy Hanks became pregnant. Lucy became pregnant outside of marriage. Whether through love, through seduction, or through something she had no say in at all, we'll never know. That pregnancy made her a criminal under the law of her community. She faced the possibility of physical punishment and certain public humiliation. She had to write a handwritten note, spelling errors and all, to marry her way out of a criminal indictment. She purchased her own respectability with a wedding date, and even that did not extend to Nancy. Nancy paid for it from the moment she entered the world. The law said she was nobody's child. She was raised by relatives not because her mother did not want her, but because the circumstances of her birth made that the survival arrangement for everyone involved. She carried a name that broadcast her origins to anyone who knew the social code. She grew up in a world that had already decided what she was worth before she'd done a single thing. And then, she raised Abraham Lincoln. Here is where I keep landing when I sit with this story. Lincoln is remembered as the great emancipator, the man who ended slavery, the man who went to war to hold a nation together around the idea that all people are created equal and that government of the people should not perish from this earth. These are the words and deeds history assigned to him, and they are real. But this same man, the one who staked his entire legacy on the principle that origin should not determine destiny, had to keep the truth about his own mother buried for his entire political life. Because that truth, in the world he actually lived in, would have been turned into a weapon against everything he was trying to build. The system he was fighting on a national stage, the one that decided your value based on the circumstances of your birth, was the same system in a different form that had marked his mother before she was born. He knew that better than anyone. He lived inside that contradiction every single day. Nancy Hanks was legally nobody's child. Her son became the president who told the country that nobody should be defined by the conditions of their birth. There is a gap between these two facts that American history has never fully reckoned with. If Lincoln's enemies had ever learned the full story, that his grandmother had been criminally indicted for the act of giving birth to his mother, that his mother was legally nobody's child, that her very name marked her illegitimacy to every neighbor who saw it, they would have weaponized it without hesitation. That is why he asked Herndon to stay silent. That is why the secret held through the debates, through the election, through 4 years of the Civil War. It never broke. And when modern science confirmed in 2015 what Lincoln had whispered in that buggy over 170 years earlier, it didn't diminish him. It showed us exactly what he was carrying in silence while doing everything history gives him credit for. The truly disturbing part of this story is not DNA. It is how much power shame once held over human lives. It is a legal system that made Lucy Hanks a criminal for getting pregnant, that classified Nancy Hanks as legally non-existent before she was born, that forced the most consequential president in American history to carry his own mother's truth in silence and pray it never came out. Those systems shaped this country in ways that we're still working through. Lincoln believed his best qualities came from Nancy. Whether that is scientifically verifiable is beside the point. He looked at all of it: the indictment, the name, the frontier cabin, the coffin he built at 9 years old, and saw not a wound, but proof that greatness can come from anywhere, even from the people a society works hardest to forget. She gave him everything he was, or hoped to be. Now we know exactly what that cost and what it meant. If this story changed the way you see American history, subscribe and hit the bell. And tell me in the comments, what other historical mysteries should modern science take on next?